Well, it's my pleasure to introduce a wonderful colleague, Chrysanthe Broikos, who is a 1996 graduate of our Architectural History program. She served for many years, and since graduation, as a curator at the National Building Museum, where she's organized over 30 exhibitions. Pretty darn impressive. And has recently also joined the A-School Dean's Council. So please join me in welcoming Chrysanthe Broikos.
Hi, welcome to session number 6, The Architecture of American Institutions. My name is Chrysanthe Broikos, and it's a pleasure and an honor to serve as the chair of this last session. Many thanks to the symposium's organizers, especially Sally, for enabling my participation. The older I get, the more I have come to appreciate Richard's uncanny ability to ask the right question at the right time. And he certainly did that for as a member of my thesis committee, and I've always been deeply grateful for that. As we've already been reminded today, one of his favorite perennial questions, right, is what exactly is American about American architecture? It is a deceptively simple question, but one that really gets to the heart of the matter. And that's why what is it that makes the architecture of any place unique or different, be it the architecture of Virginia or North Carolina or Washington, D.C.? And in a similar vein, this session seeks to identify and explore those unique attributes that have come to be identified with the civic nature of American institutions. Our first speaker today is Douglas Klahr. He is an associate professor and associate dean for faculty and student affairs at the College of Architecture, Planning, and Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Arlington. That's a pretty long title. Katherine's is almost as long or longer. So Douglas received his MAH here in 1998 and then returned to Brown University, his alma mater, to earn his PhD in 2002. As a late 19th century scholar of German, French, and American architecture and architectural photography, Douglas has had the great fortune to present papers at conferences in London, Paris, Rome, Berlin, Helsinki, Lisbon, Krakow, Washington, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and Miami, among others. I'm just glad that he can now add Charlottesville to that distinguished list. The title today of his talk is Civic Spaces and an Iconic Brand, Paradoxes of Corporate Patronage in the Carnegie Library Phenomenon. Douglas?
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's an honor and privilege to be here. And unlike most of the speakers today, I don't have a long connection with Richard Guy Wilson. My connection with him is based upon his decision to allow me to get into the program here in the first place. And for that, I am eternally grateful, and that's why it's an honor to be here. So I'm eternally grateful to him because 23 years ago, he accepted into this program a 41-year-old ex-dentist, ex-corporate training director here into UVA. Now, you think that's not normal or that's not unusual. Let me just say that when I went to Brown, Mr. Wilson, to get my PhD, the first day I was there, I was called into the dean of the graduate school, who came to me like this and said, "You are too old to get a PhD. I will refund your entire Brown tuition right now. You will never get a tenure track position. I'm doing this out of the kindness of my heart." And he was. I proceeded to go ahead. So it is because of Richard Guy Wilson that I'm here today. From 1886 until 1917, the industrialist Andrew Carnegie financed the construction of 1,689 public libraries throughout the United States, establishing a breadth of corporate architectural patronage that was unsurpassed in its day. Carnegie libraries became architectural manifestations of a locality's material and societal progress, appearing in every size of municipality, from the nation's largest cities to small towns. Two paradoxes underscored this seismic shift in American libraries. First, The public library joined the courthouse and town hall to become an iconic civic and not merely public space, wherein an individual's identity as a citizen was in the foreground, as opposed to identities of consumer, resident, worker, or worshiper. Second, although it was not Carnegie's intent, the Carnegie Library became a brand, a distinctive architectural entity that was instantly recognizable to most Americans during the first half of the 20th century, even though no consistent architectural style identified it. Several aspects of design differentiated Carnegie libraries from libraries that preceded them, especially those designed in the Richardsonian Romanesque manner that was so popular in the quarter century before Carnegie libraries began to appear. Major features that identified most Carnegie libraries were a staircase that led to a prominent central entrance, lampposts that signified the illuminating effect of knowledge, bilateral symmetry, and above all else, large windows that indicated the reading rooms within. A Carnegie library possessed a cachet that was brand specific, as illustrated by these two souvenirs produced by small towns. Even towns with pre-existing libraries sought to construct a Carnegie one. Yet this brand was strikingly independent from form, signage, and advertising, endowing it with a fluidity and mutability that remains noteworthy to this day. The notion of a brand, which usually is the engine of a corporate profit center, inadvertently was tossed or turned on its head. Instead, there arose a nationwide, unintended, non-commercial brand that functioned as a civic space, a blurring and transgression of boundaries that challenges assumptions about all these definitions. Several factors come into play regarding the specific notion of a civic space. Given today's constraints, I will focus only on two of them. Civic spaces are usually regarded as environments in which conversation is encouraged. Yet, as Ari Kelman noted in an essay, a library is involved in the production of knowledge. He observed that as an information machine, the library equipped people with skills and practices, a specific kind of reading and collective silence that would produce public discourses. The notion of a civic space therefore extends beyond the common expectation of conversation to be present at such a space. And Kelman slyly observed that the production of silence within a library was, quote, a rather noisy business, end quote. He notes that although a library was supposed to be silent, it was not mute. Walking, typing, writing, and the sounds of patrons' belongings could be heard. Public libraries may have been quiet, but a vibrant civic discourse was occurring, albeit softly. The second major factor regarding civic space was the participation of women. Not only were women most often the initial advocates regarding library construction, but in the vast majority of cases, they also voted for the tax bonds necessary to ensure proper maintenance of a desired Carnegie library, which was a stipulation of receiving a Carnegie grant. In the quarter century before the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, the right to vote was extended by local municipalities to women across the nation when it came to the issue of funding Carnegie libraries. The genesis of a civic space occurred via a civic procedure that was an exception to the norm of the time. This endowed Carnegie libraries with a singular confluence of civic parameters that was absent regarding the construction of city halls and courthouses, the other two iconic civic structures within American life. This gender aspect further differentiated the Carnegie Library from a YMCA building, whose role Theodore Roosevelt defined as, quote, being a manhood factory, end quote. As historian Paula Lupkin noted, YMCA buildings were funded by men, designed by men, and used by men. The presence of women at any stage of the process was negligible, if non-existent. There was another difference that Lupkin observed, the presence of an active central organization. Quote, throughout the first decade of the 20th century, YMCA leaders attempted to impose order and method on their architectural program, end quote. Although this met with limited success, the attempt contrasted with a largely hands-off approach by the Carnegie Foundation regarding architecture, underscoring the fluidity of this unintended national brand. Concerning brand, there are innumerable studies about brands, but most are cluttered with advertising and jargon of the second half of the 20th century. One study, however, breaks free of this to focus upon what constitutes a brand. Alicia Perry and David Wisdom's Before the Brand, Creating a Unique DNA of an Enduring Brand Identity. Perry and Wisdom describe three components of a brand. A brand is relevant to target audiences and different from the competition. Brand identity is composed of controllable elements of a company, product, or service brand, such as core essence, positioning, brand name, tagline, logo, and messaging. If identity is the fundamental state of being, then image is the state of perception. Brand image is a collection of largely uncontrollable perceptions of strengths and weaknesses gained through direct and indirect experience. So, the first element is aligned with, of course, the first element not only qualifies Carnegie Libraries as a brand, but also distinguishes them from other brands. Carnegie Libraries are relevant to their target audiences. For those audiences were the community members who initiated and advocated a town's application for a Carnegie grant. The civic discourse that resulted through balloting and voting upon tax measures created the brand's relevance. Moving to brand identity, Perry Wisdom explained, quote, the core essence is defined as the intrinsic and indispensable properties that characterize the brand. The core essence defines what your brand stands for in one or two words. Now, if we take up the challenge to define a Carnegie Library's brand core essence in 2 words, it would be this: progressive municipality. Moving to identity, well, we'll go back to that actually. We'll stay there. Brand name is the most interesting aspects of Carnegie Libraries due to Andrew Carnegie's rejection of any requirement that his name be displayed upon or within the building, as well as his extreme reluctance to attend opening ceremonies. Yet, quite often, the signage used on an exterior identified a building merely as a free or public library, not a Carnegie one. Yet, regardless of the signage, citizens regarded the building constructed through a Carnegie grant as a Carnegie Library. The person who sent this postcard of the Free Library in Bayonne, New Jersey, made certain that the recipient knew it was a Carnegie Library. This is the Carnegie Library, which is very pretty inside. Have you seen it? It was only finished last spring. So much for punctuation, but still, we get the intent of the sender there that this is a Carnegie Library. Forget the signage above the library. Brand identity begins to blur into brand image when the aspect of messaging is examined. The messaging began with a campaign to establish a Carnegie Library and continued through the medium of local newspapers, petitions, town halls, culminating in a building's dedication. At some point along this process, the medium of the postcard assumed central stage, and it is here where the line into brand image was crossed. The heightened pace of Carnegie Libraries constructed after 1900 coincided with another development, as discussed by Bernadette Lear. She writes, quote, from about 1905 to the beginning of World War I, collecting postcards was a national obsession. Americans mailed more than 600 million postcards in the 1907 to 1908 fiscal year. Within a few years, they were sending nearly 1 billion cards annually. The high point of the postcard collecting fad, roughly 1893 to 1918, correlates with Carnegie's giving program and the beginnings of many public libraries, end quote. A message written in 1913 on a postcard of Sandusky, Ohio's library underscored the cultural role that many Carnegie Libraries' auxiliary spaces played, which were available for residents to use. And this I'm quoting now. Our library has one of the finest organs in the city. Today, a recital will begin by one of the many ladies of the town, end quote. The messaging of the Carnegie Library brand through this massive postcard culture set astride the boundary between brand identity and brand image. Although the vast majority of Carnegie Library postcard senders used the medium to discuss things other than the building, there was an unwritten message that coursed beneath this postcard culture. How does this library compare with your library? Or even, how does this library compare with your Carnegie Library? Although no two Carnegie Libraries looked alike, the image was based upon direct experience when one had a Carnegie Library, and the indirect experience offered through postcard views. A doubly indirect experience occurred in this 1930s matchbook cover of an Atlanta restaurant. Instead of printing a street address, which appeared on the back side of the matchbook, the restaurant simply stated that it was next door to Carnegie Library. The underlying assumption was that a person would know where the Carnegie Library was located, or at least be able to identify it visually. Using a Carnegie Library as an address locator within a city as large as Atlanta, which featured buildings far larger and more prominent than the library, potentially underscored the potency and ubiquity of the brand. The image of the Carnegie Library, therefore, was extremely variable, yet the notion was instantly recognizable to large segments of Americans, remaining constant. The Carnegie Library brand, therefore, featured no consistent form, no advertising, and no logo. In a sense, this unusual pattern presaged by a century of the phenomenon of viral image building through social networks that is occurring today. In fact, one could argue that no contemporary example of brand image can approach that achieved by Carnegie Libraries, for to do so would entail a firm having no advertising, no logo, and no consistent product form. Apple computer products, for instance, would fail on all three accounts, for the brand's image is dependent upon these three factors. The longevity of Carnegie Library's core essence, what community does not want to be seen as progressive, suggests that Carnegie Libraries constituted not merely a brand, but an iconic one as well. As Mark Beatty, author of Brand Meaning, observed, quote, brands become truly iconic and they share certain characteristics. They evoke distinct experiences and feelings in people. They are connected to a culture and an asset of values, end quote. Corporate patronage not only created a nationwide, unintended, non-commercial brand, but created beloved iconic civic spaces precisely because the creation of the libraries themselves necessitated civic engagement, action, and longer-term commitment by and through the efforts of women. Today, 100 years later, the notion of a progressive municipality might still be defined by this gender aspect. Take note. This brief presentation was drawn from my book chapter on corporate patronage of art and architecture in the United States, which was published earlier this year by Bloomsbury. This compilation of essays by 12 scholars commences with a rethinking of corporate patronage, examining its support of artists from Maxfield Parrish to Diego Rivera. The second section of the book examines corporate patronage networks from department stores to the National Gallery of Art. The final portion, which my essay opens, looks at corporate commissions as branding and public relations from banks to U.S. Steel. I hope that my presentation has piqued your interest in this volume, and I thank the organizers once again for the honor of being here today. So, thank you.
Okay, we are going to continue with libraries, and I am delighted to introduce Jill Lord, one of my colleagues from the MAH class of 1996. Jill came straight to the A School from William and Mary and went on to conduct architectural research for the North Carolina Department of Transportation, Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, and then the Merchants House Museum in New York City. She earned her PhD from the City University of New York and has taught here at the A School, as well as at both Brooklyn and Hunter colleges. She has presented her work on public libraries at a host of venues, including the Mount Vernon House Museum, Drayton Hall, and at SAH. Her talk today is entitled The Lenox Library, Richard Morris Hunt's Search for Form and Meaning. Welcome.
All right. Thank you, Crisanthe. So my research on Richard Morris Hunt and the Lenox Library began with a chapter in my dissertation, of which Richard was a reader. I also noted that he has engaged with Hunt in his work at the Victorian Society summer schools, particularly that in Newport, Rhode Island. We see an image on the left of Richard with some of his students. I think a few of you are sitting in the room. As well as one of Hunt's more iconic works from Newport, The Breakers of 1895. In an earlier presentation today, we saw another one of Hunt's works, The Biltmore, as the backdrop to the America Castles series. So architectural historians and critics have hailed Richard Morris Hunt's Lenox Library, which was designed and constructed between 1870 and 1877 and located in New York City, as one of his finest buildings. I should note that this predates the Carnegie libraries and also predates the Richardsonian libraries. The building itself has a program which may not be familiar to us as a public library, although it was open as a public space. The library housed rare books as well as paintings, sculptures, engravings, and other objets d'art. Hunt's design signaled a shift towards his mature style, which demonstrated a confident borrowing of French elements that he fully integrated into a new American building type. Most who are not scholars of Hunt are unaware of the building. It was demolished in 1911 and was used as the foundation for Carrere and Hastings' building for Henry Clay Frick, which is now the Frick Collection on the Upper East Side. So Hunt's studies in France were undoubtedly key to his maturation. He was born in 1827 and moved to Europe with his mother and siblings when he was 16. 3 years later, in 1846, he became the first American to gain entrance and study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which Jeff Tillman told us much about their program and course of study there. This is an example of an esquisse by Hunt, one of his students' drawings that was completed on March 7th of 1849. During his time at the École, Hunt developed a lifelong interest in contemporary French architecture. He not only maintained his personal and professional connections there, but also visited France in 1861 and again in 1868, which was just 2 years prior to his beginning of the work on the Lenox Library. Up until recently, Hunt's thinking on contemporary French architecture and the theoretical grounding that Hunt drew on for the Lenox Library has remained elusive. Scholars have attempted to connect Hunt's practice in the United States with his time in France, but without identifying any explicit direct linkages from Hunt himself. Through reviewing unpublished sources and Hunt's drawings for the project, I have discovered a connection between Hunt's design for the Lenox Library and the architectural theory of the Neo-Grec embraced by Henri Labrouste and the French Romantic rationalist architects of the 1830s and 40s. In reviewing Katherine Howland Hunt's unpublished biography of her husband, I uncovered a reference to a speech made by Hunt at the Harvard Club on February 21st of 1878. This was just 1 year after the completion of the Lenox Library. In this lecture, Hunt references the chapter, "This Will Destroy That, Ceci Tuera Cela," in Victor Hugo's 1831 novel, Notre Dame de Paris. This reference finally provides architectural historians with direct knowledge of Hunt's thinking about architecture and his study in France, where he had absorbed the lessons of the Romantics of the 1830s and 40s. I believe this new information allows the Lenox Library to be definitively understood as an American adaptation of Labrousse's architectural theory of the Neo-Grec. In early 1878, the then president of Harvard, Charles William Eliot, invited Hunt to respond to the topic of architecture and its professors. At the time, Harvard did not have a school of architecture, and Eliot had hoped that Hunt's remarks would convince the wealthy donors in attendance to fund one. Hunt specifically addressed the need for Harvard to have an architecture program. He argued that the rapid expansion of the United States required a vast number of new buildings and that the architectural taste of the general population was poor and needed to be improved upon. This seems to be a through line of critics of architectural history throughout the 19th century, starting with Jefferson and continuing with Mariana van Rensselaer. Hunt, and presumably Eliot, saw the situation as an opportunity for Harvard to educate architects, raise architectural tastes, and increase architectural integrity and quality of the growing nation. According to Hunt, nothing less than a new school of architecture would accomplish this goal. Towards the end of his presentation, the most intriguing part of Hunt's speech was uttered. Hunt said, quote, "Victor Hugo, in his immortal chapter on architecture in Notre Dame de Paris, entitled Ceci Tuera Cela, or This Will Destroy That, prophesies that printing will kill architecture, that the paper leaf will replace the stone tablet, but this can never be, so long as architecture embodies the ideas of the age and the keystone rests on earnest, faithful, and well-directed study. Not only does Hunt demonstrate his knowledge of Hugo's writing, but he likely knew of Henri Labrousse critiques of that writing. According to the architectural historian Neil Levine, Labrousse corresponded with Hugo during the preparation of his chapter in late 1830 and influenced Hugo's writing about architecture. Hunt must have believed Hugo and Labrousse's argument that architecture as a means of conveying ideas was endangered and it might be eventually killed by the printed word. My discovery of Hunt's reference to Hugo's writing, and by extension, Labrousse's architectural theory, suggests that Hunt was influenced by the generation of architects who preceded him at the École, the Romantic pensionnaires of the 1820s. His adoption of Neo-Greek architectural vocabulary reflects his understanding of the theory undergirding the designs of architects such as Dubin, Henri Labrousse, Louis Duc, and Léon Vaudoyer. Like Labrousse, Hunt believed in architecture's power to embody symbolic meaning, and he wanted to capture and create that power in his designs. This is the most important element of Labrousse's influence on Hunt, and the central aspect that is reflected in his translation of the Neo-Greek style in the Lenox Library. The image that I show on the screen now is Henri Labrousse, Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève in Paris of designed in the 1840s. And this is a quintessential example of Neo-Greek architecture. In addition to sort of this very flat, taut, neoclassical wall surface, there is a merging of structure, form, and space in the building. This is a preliminary drawing that Hunt prepared for the Lenox Library. The exterior of the library, like Labrousse, Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, is also formally Neo-Greek. Which is defined as a system of architectural study that incorporated a unity of structure, space, and decoration. The Romantic architects, including Labrousse, understood architecture as a universal language that could be distilled into individual parts, for example, column, window, and wall. These essential elements do not have a specific fixed meaning, but rather they are parts that can be reordered to express new ideas and functions, such as that of a public library in architecture. At the beginning of the design process, and this is the design process that's typically used at the École des Beaux-Arts, Hunt established the building's partie. This is a fixed conception of the building which includes its plan and overall volume. And we can see in this preliminary sketch what Hunt conceives of as a partie of his building. Here is the H-shaped plan of the building, and then here is sort of a rendering of the exterior envelope of the building. Hunt has always sort of conceived it as having these large windows, much like the later Carnegie libraries, and a general sort of neoclassical detailing. We'll see in the next series of slides that Hunt manipulates this partie through a series of drawings that he prepares and shares with his client through the early 1870s. Oops. Here is one such example of that continuation of the design process that Hunt is involved with. We can see here in this upper drawing that Hunt has eliminated that sort of third story area that we saw in the earlier drawing. And here he has returned this to sort of the original conception that we saw in that preliminary sketch. Hunt also plays around with material and additional architectural decoration on the exterior of the building. Here he has rendered another version of the building done in brick. And he has also started to sort of experiment with this threshold between the street and the courtyard of the building. And then down here in the lower register, we see another version of the building, again rendered in brick and using some of the same classical detailing. So the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève was under construction while Hunt attended the École, and Hunt was undoubtedly familiar with it. The French library shares formal characteristics with the Lenox Library, but they do not share the same plan and program. As I mentioned earlier, the Lenox Library has an H-shaped plan. The Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève is essentially a rectangle. Likewise, the Lenox Library is devoid of explicit references to literature. One of the most noted things about Labrousse Library is the inscription of names on the second story, which indicates the names of the authors of the books that are housed inside. Hunt has chosen to replicate the shape and form of the window. However, he has eliminated the lower wall register and has taken away that inscription of the names. So instead of the placement of the inscriptions below the windows, Hunt altered the Neo-Grec for his American audience by focusing on the wall as an interpretation of its French antecedent. The French library, Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, was known among the design community in the United States through publications and periodicals. The organization of the exterior surface, the combination of wall, column, and window, would then therefore be recognized as a library building. By removing the names from the wall below the windows, Hunt's design referenced Labrousse Library, whereas Labrousse Library literally references the books housed within it. So in conclusion, unlike Hugo and Labrousse, Hunt, I think, was somewhat more optimistic about architecture's ability to convey meaning through its own language. It was an art form that did not rely on exterior ornament, words, or sculpture to provide meaning. Hunt was aware of the library's connection between the book and the building as expressed in Labrousse Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, but he chose to see the positive potential of architecture rather than its death. Hunt's solution for the Lenox Library focused on the arrangement of the parts of the building so that a certain viewer may understand it as a library building. Up until now, Labrusse's influence on the Lenox Library has remained unclear, primarily because it has omitted this literal exterior architectural decoration that we saw in the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève. But Hunt's Harvard Club speech reveals his reliance on the tenets of the Neo-Grec system. His library is steeped in French precedent. Once the literal connection between Labrousse and Hunt is made, the comparison illuminates Hunt's translation of the French influences into an American context. It becomes clear that Hunt used Labrusse's theoretical formulation of the Neo-Grec as a foundation for his own uniquely American architectural vision. Thank you.
Now we're going to fast forward 100 years or so. And next up is Gary Wolfe. Gary is the principal of Wolfe Architects, Inc. in Boston, and he is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. Both his design and preservation work have won numerous awards. Gary earned a BA at Cornell, an MAH here, and then a Master of Architecture from Princeton. He lectures, writes, and is active in numerous professional organizations, including Doco Momo New England, and he has served as a studio critic and juror at the GSD, RISD, and MIT. Gary is intimately familiar with the drawings for Boston City Hall, having served as a guest curator for an exhibition on the competition drawings presented at the Boston Society of Architects. His talk today is entitled Traces of a Brutalist Paradox, Democratic Design as Seen in the Drawings for Boston City Hall. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, Richard, I have to start out by saying that with all this affection being expressed by your former students these 2 days, it's only fair to point out that several people here have very mixed feelings about your career at UVA. And that's because we left before you arrived. So we didn't get a chance to study with you. However, it doesn't mean we don't celebrate your career and architectural history at UVA. This paper considers modern architecture and 20th century architectural drawings, two of many topics that Richard has addressed. In his publication, Honor and Integrity, architectural drawings by AIA gold medalists 1917 to 1983, he explored architectural drawings and the increased attention that was being given to architectural drawings in the 1980s. He observed as a final point about drawings that architectural drawings offer insights into the philosophy of an architect and sometimes are more revealing than the actual building. My paper studies a notable example of this. Boston City Hall is one of the great buildings of the international Brutalist movement. The winning design in a legendary nationwide competition in 1961 and 62, it was a work of an unknown young team led by two design critics at Columbia University, Gerhard Kallman and Michael McKinnell. Although the building's design was celebrated internationally as being magnificently monumental, in Ada Louise Huxtable's words, and binding the past to the future, in Sybil Moholy-Naj's terms, its unfamiliar concrete structure and massive brick base aroused controversy from the start, seeming to some to make the building uninviting and even brutal, an adjective suggested by Rainer Banham's perhaps unfortunate use of the term the new brutalism. To this day, one encounters people who harbor an active dislike for City Hall, despite having never visited it, nor considered any of the design attributes other than its unfriendly materiality and scale. Paradoxically, the architect's drawings delineate an open, permeable edifice designed to welcome the public and to reveal the components of government on the exterior, much like a three-dimensional civic lesson. It literally facilitates the operations of participatory government. 50 years after the building's opening, it may be a useful exercise to put aside momentarily considerations of the actual building and its plaza in order to examine what the design drawings, now at Historic New England, reveal of the architect's intentions. These often spectacular works, many of them drawn by either Kallman or McKinnell, offer a rich resource for the reassessment of City Hall's design, which might, by extension, contribute to a reevaluation of brutalism. Here we see just a small selection of the then not yet cataloged drawings that Michael McKinnell, Historic New England archivist Lorna Condon, and I were reviewing in preparation for a major exhibit. And I'm grateful to HNE for access to and permission to reproduce these drawings. Although Lorna probably wouldn't be happy about my showing all these drawings on the floor over at HNE. They just arrived. We were literally unpacking hundreds of them, and there was no place else to put them. Kallman and McKinnell's competition design began with a cross-sectional site sketch showing the proposed structure raised above an urban common and acknowledging both old and new Boston. The architects show the site with its public space, the plaza, which was part of the competition and a master plan by I.M. Pei's firm, which is what's responsible for the demolition of Scully Square for those preservationists who still are unhappy about that. From Cambridge Street at the west, the left side, past the new state government buildings to the north, the site section slopes downhill to the proposed City Hall and then, further east, terminates at Faneuil Hall. Built in 1742 as the city's meeting hall and market at that time, expanded by Charles Bulfinch in 1805. The conceptual design featured interpenetrating multi-story spaces with everyday transactional public activities located on the lower floors accessible to the public, the ceremonial spaces of government on the middle level, and administrative office space on the upper tiers. The first floor competition plan reveals the entire south end of the building at the right, free of walls. Facing Washington Street, the original road to the peninsula of Boston from the mainland. Just 100 yards south of this is the townhouse from 1711, now known as the Old State House, and the public meeting place for the community before Faneuil Hall. Coleman and McKinnell called the design a crossroads. City Hall was to be not only a destination to attend a city council meeting or to get a marriage license, it was a covered passage and a gathering place. Its open ground floors were a variation on the type seen in Faneuil Hall and in city halls throughout Europe, where government offices and meeting rooms were located above open markets and arcades. The architects described it as a multi-level forum, conceived as an extension of the city's pedestrian networks. On the south, in the competition drawings, entrance stairs run across nearly the entire elevation, facing Washington Street. The north-south section illustrates this open south end at the right and an ascension to an upper level and an outdoor courtyard, while another route passed through toward the north entrance, one level down, past the city clerk's windows. Another architectural promenade in this crossroads climbs from the plaza entrance to a viewing platform that overlooks Faneuil Hall, as though from a hilltop belvedere. This artificial hill represented, or represented in the architect's terms, the ground of Boston, paved with Boston's traditional red brick. It recalled John Winthrop's biblical metaphor dating to Boston's founding in 1630. We shall be as a city upon a hill, a phrase derived from the Sermon on the Mount in the book of Matthew. This reference was current at the start of the design competition because President-elect Kennedy, from Boston, of course, elaborated on it on a speech at the Massachusetts State House early in 1961. Part hillside amphitheater, part Acropolis staircase, Coleman and McKinnell's Mount can be seen as a transformation of the grand staircases of Baroque and neoclassical architecture, which served aristocratic audiences for a public passage, a citizen's staircase. This west to east promenade was symbolic as well because the concluding view looking out not only encompassed Faneuil Hall, the seat of the American Revolution, but extended beyond to Boston Harbor, the Atlantic Ocean, and the rising sun. Coleman's drawing here of the mayor's office shows the eastward view at daybreak, a new dawn, with Faneuil Hall at midground, a prospect encompassing the past and the future. This section perspective drawing, a convention sometimes also called a cutaway drawing perspective, is one of many that Coleman drew to elucidate the building. The distinctive, relatively unusual representational technique combines the conceptual elements of a cross-section, as seen here in the beams overhead, with the perceptual characteristics of a perspective. As design progressed, the path down to Faneuil Hall became a stair alongside the south of City Hall, seen in this sepia print, answering the downward warping of the plaza on the north side, seen in this postcard view. The original planned interior passage to the east, where the competition program had proposed a large platform to span Congress Street, was not realized. Coleman and McKinnell's locating the key spaces of governance on the building's periphery instead of burying them deep within also illustrates the political philosophy behind City Hall. The middle plan here disperses these ceremonial spaces on the fifth level around the south lobby. Here they are here. In the section on the left, the City Council Library, later converted to additional councilors' offices, cantilevers out, with the council chamber on the opposite side. No layer of administrative offices or traditional pochette of corridors and service spaces and stairways buffers elected officials from the world outside. Passerbys can see where the workings of government occur. Inside, elected officials may find it difficult to ignore a rally or a protest outside. The council chamber's amphitheater-like volume floats above the plaza in this plaza entrance in this section perspective sketch. Anyone approaching the building, can read the three-dimensional form of the stepped seating of this public meeting space overhead. On the elevations, the architects articulated these spaces to demarcate their civic importance. Although the framing brackets are abstract and often fragmented, they are in some ways analogous to edicules on historic structures. In fact, citing John Summerson, McKinnell would note that edicules represent the fact of human occupancy. In this case, abstract little modern houses occupied by Boston's elected representatives. Design studies explored the fenestration patterns, the doors, the light and shadow for these hoods. As built, these frames stand out against a small repetitive module of administrative floors above and the massive brick base below. The design and construction of City Hall launched the transformation of Boston and the rebirth of optimism about the city. It was, of course, a time of ambitious plans, whether urban renewal, putting a man on the moon, or building grand public edifices. The building became an instant landmark and an active new center for the city. It hosted events and gatherings that most traditional city halls could never accommodate. The Boston Symphony Orchestra performed here. 2 days after Queen Elizabeth visited the Rotunda, as we saw in Lydia's slide, City Hall hosted a gala luncheon for her, right there amidst all the concrete and brick. And the building's halls and lobbies housed countless art exhibits, public performances of various types, memorable protests, and celebrations. According to Douglas Santucci's definitive Built in Boston, City Hall is arguably the great building of 20th century Boston. And there are a lot of others to compete with that. The Getty Foundation awarded the city one of its prestigious Keeping It Modern architectural conservation grants for City Hall, part of the Getty's efforts to help preserve significant 20th century structures around the world. Although the brutalist monumentality and materiality of Boston City Hall continue to elicit negative interpretations of the building for seeming to be authoritarian and uninviting, this assessment of the architectural drawings seeks to demonstrate paradoxically that the rugged and perhaps off-putting concrete and brick of Boston City Hall's design actually serve idealistic democratic principles. These principles, the building seems to assert, should be as essential and as enduring as cast in concrete, as City Hall's poured-in-place piers, precast modules, and brick base. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to travel backwards again in time. Our next and last speaker is Katherine Rogers Merlino. She is an associate professor of architecture and an adjunct associate professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Washington's College of Built Environments. See, I told you, Douglas, hers is close. In addition to teaching both graduate and undergraduate studios, her portfolio includes architectural history and theories of preservation. After receiving a BA in architecture from the University of Washington, Katherine practiced in Seattle for several years and worked with Olson Kundig. She then earned a Master's of Architecture and her MAH from UVA in 1999. She is the director of the Center for Preservation and Adaptive Reuse, and her book, which was for sale earlier today, Building Reuse, Sustainability, Preservation, and the Value of Design, advocates for a larger view of preservation, looking at buildings as repositories of material and energy, a critical value in an era of climate change. Her talk today is titled Of Fairs, Fur, and the Neoclassical Tradition. Welcome, Katherine.
Thank you. Wow, there's nothing like being the last person. I am the one who's standing between you and the tickets in here for your drinks at the Rotunda. So I am so happy to be back in Charlottesville. It's been about a decade, and it has actually changed quite a bit. And I was thinking back to my time here as a dual degree candidate. I initially came and applied to the Masters of Architecture program because when I came, they said I was going to be entered into the 3-year program instead of the 2-year program because they had never had anyone from Washington University. I said, I'm from the University of Washington, not Kansas, Seattle. So it was quite interesting. They switched me to the 2-year program, thank God. And I remember a discussion with Richard once when I was saying, should I do 2 degrees? Does this make sense? And I remember him saying distinctly that this would be one of the more powerful combinations. And then I started taking his classes. And I remember probably the most important thing that I learned is that he felt like, I usually identify more as an architect since I practiced for a while, and I felt like he was an architect speaking as an architectural historian. And that to me was so powerful because I really felt like that was something, he really understands the way you build buildings and also how the human narrative and the story behind how they're constructed is a critical part of understanding architecture. And I did not really have that in my undergraduate at the University of Washington. We have changed that though, so it's gotten much better. I also have to say one of the things that he taught me is just how to teach, the way he represented with a variety of images and, of course, the cartoons, which are to this day. I have a collection of over 100 cartoons, and I use them in all of my lectures. Humor is critical in this time, so when you teach. So as Hector said, everybody tells jokes or has been telling jokes all day and yesterday as well. And I usually am known for really bad jokes in my classes, but since this is 10 minutes, I don't have one. So I'm going to tell you a joke. Marble is a valuable building material, and it shouldn't be taken for granted. Wow, you actually laughed at that. That's a horrible joke. So on that, I'm going to talk about a building made of wood. So this paper is about a campus architectural building. I'm also learned that Richard's mother went to the University of Washington, not this early, I'm sure, but I'm very excited to have that relationship to talk about a really interesting building, one of the most fascinating buildings I've studied before. I'm also an architect, and I don't read papers very often. I usually present at sustainability and design conferences, so please forgive my reading if I don't do it so smoothly as the rest of you. Towering fir trees, shining bodies of water, and snow-covered mountains have characterized descriptions of the Pacific Northwest for generations. Such visions emphasize the abundant resources of the region and celebrated a time when there was a perception of infinite abundance in the landscape. Native trees in particular were considered an endless resource and one that might be harvested for generations. We've learned a little bit more about that now. The optimism in a landscape of bounty was reflected in the construction of the Washington State Forestry Building at the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition, or AYP for short, held in Seattle on the newly moved University of Washington grounds. As most world fairs, buildings at expositions were meant to be temporary, but what remains of the grounds are some of the original plans by the Olmsted brothers, especially the spectacular view called the Rainier Vista that you see here, a great example of borrowed scenery, a phrase that I learned in this classroom, thank you, Reuben Rainey, to the view of Mount Rainier. I also want to mention this building. This is one of the 2 buildings that remains. One is a wood structure, and this is a masonry building that still exists. It is now Architecture Hall, where my office is located. And both of these things are just subtle plugs for the Society of Architectural Historians conference held in Seattle next spring that you all must come to. The Alaska-Yukon Exposition, or AYP, was Washington's first World Fair. Second one, of course, 1962 with the Seattle Space Needle. It opened on June 1st, 1909, and closed on October 16th. More than 3 million people visited the fair, nearly 80,000 the very first day alone. The event was a critical one, not only for planning the newly relocated Seattle campus by the Olmsted brothers, but also to announce the idea that Seattle, just 10 years after the Alaska-Yukon gold rush, was not only a pass-through for that gold rush, but a major institutional and civic center in its own right. And someone had mentioned earlier about postcards and how many postcards. There are so many postcards from the AYPE, and I just love all of them. They're very, especially the one on the bottom right. Hello, Bill, meet me at the pastry, which of course was the fun place with all the games. So that's the building right there. Newspapers, brochures, and first-hand accounts call the Forestry Building the most striking building on the grounds to date. Here is an image of the building right there. You can see from this former slide that these buildings, most of the buildings, like many World's Fairs, modeled after specifically the Chicago World's Fair, were made of marble and framed with wood behind. So they're meant to look very permanent. When you look at the Forestry Building, you can barely pick it out in this image on the kind of looking at the right. And here it is on the map, taking a prominent vista position just in the access between the entrance and you cross through the Rainier Vista. Advertised as the largest log structure ever built to date, it represented a unique merging of the classical style expected to dominate the architecture of the World's Fair with a regional character expressed by the use of massive native logs. In many advertisements for the fair, the building was described as having the lines of a Greek temple, which immediately gave it connection to classical precedents in architecture. However, in stark contrast to the other buildings in the fair that were clad in light marble and refined in detail, the Forestry Building was constructed entirely of unpeeled logs of native fir with the bark still clinging to its surface. While the building was unique, it was not completely without precedent or alone in its originality. Rustic buildings, as they were often called, have been included at World's Fair since at least 1893. At the World's Columbia Exposition in Chicago, 2 buildings used whole log construction. The Idaho Pavilion, designed by Spokane architect Kirtland Cutter, who also designed several buildings in Seattle, and we'll have many tours of his buildings at the SAH conference, was constructed of logs cleanly peeled of their bark. The Washington State Building in Chicago, designed by Seattle architect Warren Skillings, was rustic in character with logs at the base of the exterior walls in an exposed frame with stucco infill. Perhaps the building with the strongest connection in form and detail to the AYP building was the Forestry Building at the 1905 Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition in Portland, Oregon. It's funny, I don't have to say Oregon in Seattle, I have to say that here. Large in scale, it had the exterior appearance of an oversized log cabin with pitched roofs, shed roofs, and an asymmetrical plan. It also had some unpeeled logs. Designed by the architect A.E. Doyle of the leading Portland firm, Whidden & Lewis, the building was nicknamed the Log Parthenon because the interior had a colonnaded double-height space, which was framed by these unpeeled logs with the bark intact and reflected a nave-like interior. By the time of the fair in Seattle in 1909, the logging industry had been in full swing for nearly half a century. Beginning with Henry Esler's first steam-powered mill on Elliott Bay in 1852, logging towns and mills were spread throughout the region, taking advantage of abundant waterways for transportation and new technologies of cutting the wood, such as the steam donkey, which was invented in 1881, and of course ever-improving railways. With millions of acres of untouched virgin forest, the region's landscape appeared to have infinite resources. Mills produced building lumber, finely milled shingles, roof shakes, and other products bound for destinations both stateside and abroad. Due to the importance of the timber industry, it was decided that the most important building at the fair, and one that would be allocated the most funds, would be the Forestry Building. It was given the highest priority and funding for its location and its representation of the region. Although initially the chief AYP architects of Hallwood and Galloway proposed preliminary designs for all 3 buildings in Nome Circle, the location of the AYP Forestry Building, the commission ultimately hired the newly California Imports, we have a lot of those in Seattle, architectural firms of Saunders and Lawton for the Forestry Building design. Although very little evidence remains of the design process, final drawings, written descriptions, and photographs, along with numerous newspaper accounts, reveal that the building was a long rectangular structure with a curved colonnaded entrance portico. The building was massive in scale. It was 324 feet long, 145 feet wide, and 2 stories in height. The overall form of the building suggested a translation of a Roman or Greek civic structure, fully symmetrical with classical triangular pediments at each end and rows of columns forming a colonnade that followed the lines of Gnome's Circle. The central hall was 2 stories, as mentioned, and was surrounded by a second-floor balcony that could be reached by one of the 4 staircases. At both the northern and southern ends of the building were 2 octagonal towers, accessible by spiral staircases that wrapped around a large 5-foot diameter tree. While this form suggested classical antecedents, the architectural language emphasized not classicism, but timber scale, strength, and abundance. For rather than the buff brick and painted stucco that was the typical architectural finish of interiors of most of the buildings at the fair, the Forestry Building frame was constructed entirely of natural, old-growth fir logs with their bark intact. This not only created a rough, rustic interior, but also created the sense that you were actually in a forest. These massive columns serve not only as the structure of the building, but also as an expression of different form and finishes that timber could achieve. While undoubtedly influenced by its cousin at the Portland Lewis and Clark Exposition, there's a clear distinction from the informal vernacular presentation in Portland to the formal arrangement of the Seattle building. As Seattle was trying desperately to establish itself as the timber capital of the Pacific Northwest region, as well as a sophisticated civic capital, this unique hybrid of classicism and rustic regionalism, Saunders and Lawton at once established a formal civic presence utilizing these raw, unfinished materials from the forest. A total of 124 unpeeled log columns, each 5'6" in diameter and 54 feet in height. Okay, just pause on that for a moment. Reportedly, each weighing 50,000 pounds, created the building frame. Floor beams, joists, purloins, and other structural members were made of additional whole logs ranging from 12 inches to 50 inches, as indicated in the drawing, and the majority of them still sheathed in their bark. The bottom right is from the Daily, which is our UW newspaper, and almost every day, if you look up the Daily, there was an article about just this building. It was such a unique and kind of a curiosity, really, by the students who wrote the paper. Each of the log columns rested on octagonal concrete and iron reinforced piers to support the massive weight of the frame, and 8x8 posts and 8x10 girders braced the floor in between the piers. And a continuous concrete foundation was poured to support the exterior frame wall. While not considered one of the official permanent structures built for the fair, like Architecture Hall, which was originally the Fine Arts Palace, Commission's records indicate that they intended the building to be a permanent gift to the university, ensuring the building's longevity by spending extra money, especially in the construction of such an extensive foundation system. Saunders and Lawton wanted the columns to look and even smell fresh from the forest, so they wrote specific and precise instructions to the contractors to choose only winter-cut trees with all of the bark intact. Winter-cut trees have much higher moisture content, and they would last longer. Officially. I mean, if you use them moist, which none of us do because that's not a good idea. They planned for careful shipping and handling once they were felled. A spur track was constructed specifically by the Northern Pacific Railroad, J.J. Hill financing it himself, who was the owner of Northern Pacific, right to the back door of the building site to transport the logs to the site. 2 flat rail cars were required to carry a single 54-foot log that comprised a single column. In between the massive columns, the building demonstrated several finishes and exhibited creative uses of timber in many forms and different scales. Many methods of cut siding were used to adorn the exterior. Horizontal and vertical logs and cut siding were installed at the base to cover the concrete foundation, and horizontal shiplap siding, hand-split cedar shingles at the lower and upper levels, and bark veneer covered the triangle pediment at the exterior in the roof. Specifications indicated, quote, "Where work calls for veneering with bark, cedar bark is to be used, and it was to be fastened with galvanized nails. As specified by the architects, the highest level of craftsmanship was sought throughout the building." Oh, this is supposed to be that's not a phase 1. This is my favorite picture. Look at that. How do you think they got these kids to sit still on this thing? This, people, is old growth timber. We don't have that left anymore. The architects noted that all work was to be fitted together in neat as a manner as possible where the bark had been removed, and the same was to be replaced. The same was to be replaced if the scarred places trimmed and bare places stained as directed. The mitered corners of the column capitals were to be caps formed with bark on, mitered at each angle. They were formed using, for decorative elements, round coins were formed by using cuts from the ends of smaller logs nailed to the exterior, and dentils were formed by sawn beam ends of cedar and fir. Each of these classical details from a distance would have read like a classical building, but offered quite a surprise upon closer observation. This is a great image of just seeing you can't get too close. Well, how much they love the building, apparently. But just the finish that we used, the rough sawn stairs covering the concrete, and then the different types of siding, as well as the wood windows they created. The forestry building's interior functioned as both a display area for exhibits and an exhibit itself. One display illustrated timber at every stage of the manufacturing process, from felled tree to finished flooring, paneling, millwork, and decorative elements, illustrating the final product or the finished product and the craft of Washington's timber resources. In the center of the immense main hall, a large stump was installed in a manner that appeared that it had been there the entire time. The massive scale, the woodsy smell, the rough texture, and even a sense of dampness that one would feel walking through a Northwest forest was replicated and was in many ways, was perhaps meant to be an idealized or classicized wilderness. I have to say, this image on the top right was the emblem of the AYPE, and about 10 years ago, I was walking in the basement of, ironically, the Forestry Building circles. There's 3 buildings, and I found it in the basement, in a corner, in a concrete, right next to a storage area that nobody knew that it was there. We're still trying to move it to the Washington Museum, Mohi. It's so large, it's actually hard to get out the door, so they don't know how they got it in the first place. So that was an interesting find. At the close of the fair, the building, originally intended to house the School of Forestry, was turned into the Washington State Museum. Then it was turned into school laboratories, and finally, university storage. However, problems with, can you guess? Dry rot were quickly a concern for its stability and future use. The rotting, no doubt, began almost immediately as the logs were winter cut, high in moisture, and not allowed to dry appropriately before construction. Along with the attached bark, which promoted insect infestation, makes me laugh because it's so obvious, but primarily with beetles, the building quickly lost structural integrity. By 1913, the scale and number of logs meant rotting locations and infestation became too intense to repair. The building was declared unsafe by university engineers in 1921, and although it remained a tourist attraction for 2 decades, the building was finally destroyed in June of 1930. One of the best stories from the Daily was right 2 years before it was demolished, when they were describing, one of the students was giving a tour, and somebody said, "Is the building moving?" And everyone went, "Ah!" and ran out, and they told this big story about it. During its short tenure, the Forestry Building served as a beacon of optimism for the Pacific Northwest at a time when the region was grasping for a regional identity. While the building's general design suggested a European classical tradition, its fresh, rough, rustic sensibility expressed the unique character of the Pacific Northwest and the rich promise of its most precious resource. What it lacked in permanence by the fault of construction, it expressed in grand optimism in the fast-growing region. At the least, it reflected a common sentiment at the time that was bursting with pride for the region, as stated in one of the promotional brochures of the AYP, and I quote, "This is a great country. It is vast in extent, rich in resources, and full of promise. It has wonderfully fertile and productive soil, splendid forests of valuable lumber, extensive deposits of useful minerals, and the greatest fisheries in the world, splendid rivers, lakes, and inland seas, and the grandest mountains upon the American continent." And it was, in fact, regarding the Forestry Building that an unnamed and unknown prominent visitor, in quotation marks, once remarked, "Mount Rainier and the Forestry Building had the same architect." Thank you.
Why don't we give that last group and all our presenters second round of applause. And I don't know who's speaking next. Are you coming up? Okay. Do we have time? Do we have time for questions? I know the reception doesn't start till 5:30. Are there questions? Any questions? Yeah. Yes, right here.
Okay.
So this question is for Katherine. Can you hear this? Yeah? No? It's not on, right? Oh, it is? Okay. So, Katherine.
Yes, Sarah.
Yeah. So, old growth, when you say old growth, how many years old is each of these columns, roughly? What are we talking about?
I'm going to guess because I don't know the exact
Sure.
year. I would guess they were probably at 5 feet. They were probably 300 years old.
300 years old each. And
Each.
how many columns?
154. And most of those are gone. But we do have some really big trees left.
Right.
But not, yeah.
But we're talking about tens of thousands of years.
Yes. And we didn't really realize that was not necessarily a good thing to cut those trees down. But yeah, they're old. Not as old as the Notre Dame ones, or the Notre Dame up in the
Right.
forest, but they're old.
I just had a follow-up question about the problem of the logs deterioration. That the Park Service has a number of lodges with massive monolithic lodges that have endured. Was there a lack of intent to dry the logs and treat them thoroughly, or was it intended to be a temporary building in the first place?
Well, it was intended to last for a long time until it rotted. They knew it was going to rot. So when you do a winter cut, a felled tree for a cedar tree, for example, it has about 20 to 25% moisture. Ideal building lumber should be kiln dried to 11, 12, 13. You can't kiln dry anything with a bark on tack. The bark would fall off, and they wanted the bark. That was really the key part. And you can't really go through and pick out the beetles either, because that's just too much work. So it was meant to be permanent as long as it lasted. They didn't really know. They were not people who built in this material, so they probably were hoping and being very optimistic.
What a wonderful day. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Okay, well, we still have time. What a wonderful day. I have the pleasant task of announcing that the event that you've really come here for is about to take place next, and we're all going to move to the Dome Room, and we'll regroup at 5:30. As you figured out that there are 2 tickets for you that in your name badge. It's a great strategy to keep your name badge intact. So hold on tight to those, and let's just have another round of applause to the 2 days